Our text for today is Acts chapter 28, the first 10 verses. Acts chapter 28, verses 1 through 10. Now when they had escaped, they then found out that the island was called Malta. And the natives showed us unusual kindness, for they kindled a fire and made us all welcome, because of the rain that was falling and because of the cold. But when Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and laid them on the fire, a viper came out because of the heat and fastened on his hand. So when the natives saw the creatures hanging from his hand, they said to one another, "No doubt this man is a murderer, whom though he has escaped the sea, yet justice does not allow to live." But he shook off the creature into the fire and suffered no harm. However, they were expecting that he would swell up or suddenly fall down dead. But after they had looked for a long time, and they saw no harm come to him, they changed their minds and said that he was a god. Isn't that just like folks? One minute he's a murderer, next minute he's a god. In that region there was an estate of the leading citizen of the island, whose name was Puryear, who received us and entertained us courteously for 3 days. And it happened that the father of Publius lay sick of a fever and dysentery. Paul went into him and prayed and laid his hands on him and healed him. So when this was done, the rest of those on the island who had diseases also came and were healed. They also honored us in many ways, and when we departed, they provided such things as were necessary. And may God bless the reading of his word today. As you can easily see, our theme for Vacation Bible School this year is shipwrecked. Now, there aren't that many literal physical shipwrecks found in the Bible. But in the 27th chapter of the book of Acts, there is a shipwreck in the Bible. A big, bad shipwreck. The Apostle Paul was on a ship headed for Rome. Now, Paul is not on this ship taking a summer vacation cruise to lovely Italy. No, Paul is a prisoner on this ship. He's headed for a Roman prison, and then a Roman trial, and then eventually a Roman execution. But before they get to Rome, a terrible storm hit the ship. A storm that lasted for weeks on end without any let-up. A storm that eventually sank the ship. But due to the amazing grace and the awesome power of God, all 276 men on board made it safely to land. And that's where we pick up our text this morning. The Apostle Paul and that ship's crew shipwrecked on the island called Malta. And from our text, we're going to see God's mighty hand at work in their lives as they were shipwrecked. And pay close attention, my friend, not because I bring the message, but because the fact of life is this. As we sail through this world, we're going to get shipwrecked. Storms are going to come each of our ways, and we all at some time or another are going to find ourselves shipwrecked. So pay attention. First of all, let's note God's people for this shipwreck. When they arrived on this island, Paul and the crew are totally at the mercy of those people living on that island. They have no weapons to defend themselves. Their weapons are at the bottom of the sea with the ship. They have no money to buy anything with, or no cargo to trade for anything. All of that's at the bottom of the sea with that ship. They are exhausted near the point of death from fighting that storm. They're starving to death. They probably have very little clothes on, if any. My point is, those people on that island, could have done anything they wanted to with Paul and that crew, including having them for supper. But look at how they treated them. Verse 2, they showed them unusual kindness. They kindled a fire and made us all welcome. Verse 7, the leading citizen of the island entertained them courteously. And verse 10, they honored us in many ways. Paul and those men could not have landed on an island with nicer and better people. They could not have met a more caring and compassionate people. They could not have encountered a more helpful and loving people. These people literally saved Paul's life, along with the rest of that crew. For without these people being the kind of people they were, Paul and that crew would have perished on that island. But they survived. And they survived because God had some people there to get them through their shipwreck. And then secondly, we note God's protection for their shipwreck. In verse 3, a seeming tragedy hit the crew. As Paul is helping build a fire, a viper came out of the heat and fastened on his hand. Paul has just been bitten by a poisonous, venomous snake, and there was no hospital on that island of Malta. So death appears to be sure and certain, unavoidable for Paul. Paul had had many close calls in his life, but this time it looks like Paul is done for. He's finished. He will never see Rome. He'll never get off that island alive. But look in verse 5. He shook off the creature into the fire and suffered no harm. Verse 6. They looked for a long time and saw no harm come to him. Now, Paul was tough. He was thick-skinned, but he was still human. He wasn't that tough. He was just flesh and bone like we are. He was no match against a poisonous snake. So how do you explain this? There's only one explanation. That was the protection of God. God's protection was greater than that snake's poison. God was going to protect Paul and see to it that he made it to Rome. So be it a storm out at sea or be it a snake on the land, God's protection was at work in Paul's life during his shipwreck. And then thirdly, we note God's power for their shipwreck. Verse 8, the father of the island's leading citizen became very sick. So what happened? Paul went to the man, prayed, laid his hands on him, and healed him. But look at verse 9. The rest of those on the island who had diseases also came and were healed. Now, how do you explain this? How was Paul, not even a physician like Luke, how was he able to heal all these people of whatever ailed them? The answer? The power of God. You see, God answered Paul's prayer and used him as the vessel and the agent to heal these people. Now, let's be clear. It wasn't the power of Paul that healed all these people. No, it was the power of God, the power of the great physician at work. Yes, it was Paul's hand laying on these people, but it was God's mighty hand laying on Paul's hand that did the actual healing. So from all this healing and health going on and taking place, we see God's power at work during this shipwreck. And then we note God's provision for their shipwreck. We've already seen the people's provision in how they welcomed this bunch. We've seen their provision as the way they treated them during their stay, but then look in verse 10. Look at how they treated them on their departure. When they departed, they were provided with such things as were necessary. Now remember, when they arrived on that island, they didn't have one bite of food. They didn't have one crumb to eat. Again, probably no clothing from that storm and wreck, no shelter, nothing. But while on that island, they were provided with everything they needed. While on that island, they never missed a meal. They probably put on a few pounds. On that island, they had shelter, they had clothing. And when they left with everything they needed to make it on to Rome. And from this, we see God's provision for Paul and these men every day and every way. And again, I emphasize, they had no way to provide any of this for themselves. No weapons to take any of this, no money to buy for any of this, no cargo to trade for any of this. No, this was God at work using these island people as his source of provision for Paul in his shipwreck. So do you see how God was with Paul and how God took care of him in his shipwreck? Now here's the good news for us, folks. When life causes us to be shipwrecked, and it does, God will be with us. He'll be there with us, no matter what kind of shipwreck it is, no matter what shipwrecked our life, be it spiritual, mental, emotional, be it family, be it finances, be it a job, be it school, be it work, be it play, it doesn't matter. God will be there. And what he did for Paul, he'll do for you, and he'll do for me. God will put people in our lives during our shipwreck to get us through. You think of some shipwrecks you've been in, and you think of those people that got you through those shipwrecks. They weren't there by accident or coincidence. God put them there. And then in your shipwreck, you think how God protected you. But if it wasn't for his protection, you wouldn't have got through that shipwreck. And you think about God's power in your shipwreck. Again, without his power at work in your life, you would not have got through your shipwreck. And then you think about God's provisions. You look back in hindsight at that shipwreck, and you see that everything you really needed, not everything you wanted, but everything you really needed, God provided. Paul got through his shipwreck. Paul got off that island. And Paul got to Rome. All because he kept his faith in God. All because he kept depending on, relying on, hanging on, holding on, clinging on, and leaning on God throughout his shipwreck. Is this easy to do in our shipwrecks? No. But friends, it's the only real way to get through the shipwreck. So when you find yourself in a shipwreck, you do what Paul did. You keep relying on God. You draw closer to him, not further away, but closer to him. You keep relying and depending and holding on to him. And he will get you off that island. He will get you through your shipwreck. He will get you to the place you need to be. And he will get you to the person you need to become. Because you see, folks, he's not only the master of the sea, he's also the master of the shipwrecks. Could I get an amen on that? Amen. I don't ask for many amens, but I ask for one on that. He's the master of the shipwreck.